Electorally Un / Elected, a partnership between Andrew Jackson's Hermitage and the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum. We're really excited to have all of you join us today. We had over 160 registrants across 27 states plus Washington, D.C. Tonight, Christy will be our moderator, and she's the executive director at the Hayes Library. So I'll let her take over, and thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Jossie. As she said, I'm Christy Weininger. I'm the executive director here at Spiegel Grove, which is the estate of 19th President and First Lady of the United States, Rutherford and Lucy Hayes. We here at the Hayes Presidential Library and Museums are so excited for the opportunity to partner with Andrew Jackson's The Hermitage. We love partnering with other Sorry, I apologize. I think something happened with my sound there. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. So as Jossie was saying, my name is Christy Weininger. I'm the executive director of the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums. And Josh, who I will be introducing here momentarily, Josh and I are coming to you from the beautiful grounds of Spiegel Grove in Northwest Ohio. Spiegel Grove is the 25-acre estate of Rutherford and Lucy Hayes. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. We appreciate you being here. And I also want to thank Andrew Jackson's The Hermitage. Jossie and Aaron have just been wonderful to work with. We love partnering with other sites, and it's been our particular pleasure to partner with this particular presidential site. Has been especially nice for us. So we are doing a series of programs this year on democracy that will lead us into the presidential election. And I also want to thank our sponsor of that series, KF Construction and Excavating, located here in Sandusky County, Ohio. They have been an excellent community partner for us, and we really appreciate their help and making this and that whole series of democracy programs possible. So we have two speakers for you this evening, Josh from our site and Aaron from the Hermitage, and I'm going to be introducing them here momentarily. But as you have questions, we're going to save all questions for the end, so you can go ahead and put those in the chat box. And Jossie and I are going to tag team at the end of this program and get your questions answered. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Joshua Dubbert, the historian here at Hayes Presidential Library and Museums. In prior positions with the Wisconsin Historical Society and the Rhode Island Historical Society, Josh worked as a curatorial assistant and museum assistant. Dubbert's research focuses on Victorian America, particularly its culture, art, architecture, and the era's presidents. He lectures on the Gilded Age, Victorian costume, 19th century architecture, and performs dramatic readings of the work of Edgar Allan Poe. He enjoys giving public programs and tours of the Hayes home, sharing the fascinating history of Hayes, his presidency, his family, and his era with the public. So Josh, I'm turning things over to you.
All right, thanks, Christy. Let me share my screen here. Right. Well, thanks again, Christy, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. The election of 1876 was unquestionably one of the most controversial political campaigns in United States history, occurring as it did at a time when military occupation of the South was ending and white supremacy gaining strength. The contest between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden threatened to pull apart the recently reunited Union. So in tandem with this was the concern for the rights of 4 million African Americans freed from slavery. Scholarship has produced a number of perspectives on the subject, but the result of 1876 and its legacy have often been misconstrued in context to this fractious moment in American history, in large part due to inaccurate historical interpretation. Now, one argument in particular, the so-called Compromise of 1877, is probably the most important of these, making the election seem more the pivotal moment in American history than perhaps it really was. Tonight, I'm going to be talking, of course, about the election of 1876, but I'll also be examining how it has been misinterpreted and how it relates to the post-war period known as Reconstruction. So before we get going on the election itself, I'd like to give a little background on Rutherford for those of you that aren't familiar with his story. So he was born in Delaware, Ohio on October 4th, 1822. Rutherford's father died 2 months before he was born, so he was raised by his mother, Sophia, and the father figure in his life was his maternal uncle, Sardis Burchard, who would move to Fremont, Ohio, then known as Lower Sandusky, and become a successful merchant. So he bought the land and built the house that would become Spiegel Grove here from where myself and Christy are talking to you from. Rutherford was educated at Kenyon College and Harvard, and he would move to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he married Lucy Ware Webb on December 30th, 1852. So Lucy was a temperance advocate, and she was staunchly anti-slavery, a stance that influenced Rutherford. In Cincinnati, Rutherford served as city solicitor, and he defended at least 2 runaway slaves in the 1850s. When the Civil War began, Rutherford joined the Ohio 23rd Volunteer Infantry as a major. He fought all 4 years in the war. And in 1864, he was elected to Congress, but refused to take his seat until the conflict had ended. In 1865, he finally did take his seat, and he was reelected in 1866, and then he became Ohio's governor the following year, and he would serve 3 terms before being elected president in 1876, which brings us up to the election itself. So political victory in 1875 brought Hayes national attention as a possible presidential candidate, and out of 9 candidates, he was selected at the 1876 Republican National Convention in Cincinnati. Hayes's opponent was Samuel J. Tilden of New York, also a prominent attorney and governor of New York. So the results of Election Day, Tuesday, November 7th, 1876, was 4,034,311 votes for the Republican Hayes and 4,288,546 for the Democrat Tilden. So the initial electoral count was 184 for Tilden and 165 for Hayes. So 185 electoral votes were needed for victory. On December 6th, the Electoral College met in each state and cast their ballots. Though Tilden appeared to receive a plurality of the vote in excess of 250,000, the Republicans challenged the electoral count of 19 votes in these 3 contested states, Florida 4, Louisiana 8, and South Carolina 7. So the Democrats responded by challenging one of Oregon's electoral votes. This stemmed from one of the Oregon electors being a government employee, which technically made him ineligible to serve as an elector. So Oregon's Democratic governor appointed a Democrat to serve in place of this disqualified Republican elector. If Tilden were to win even a single vote from any of these contested states, he would be victorious, but Hayes would need all 20 votes. All right, so getting back to the electoral votes that I mentioned in the contested states. So Florida's was 4, Louisiana's was 8, and South Carolina's 7. So the Democrats responded by challenging one of Oregon's electoral votes. This stemmed from one of the Oregon electors being a government employee, which technically made him ineligible to serve as an elector. So Oregon's Democratic governor appointed a Democrat to serve in place of this disqualified Republican elector. And if Tilden were to win even a single vote from any of these contested states, he would be victorious, but Hayes would need all 20. So I think we're caught up now. The official vote tally in the 3 contested southern states had Tilden leading by 6,500 in Louisiana and only 94 in Florida. So Hayes led in South Carolina, but only by around 1,000 votes. So the dispute itself stemmed from the electors from both parties appearing before the 3 states' returning boards with their results, both claiming to be winners. So these returning boards had the power to decide which votes were valid and which were not. The Republicans controlled these boards in all 3 of the contested southern states. So when considering whether a vote should be allowed, they looked at several aspects of voter fraud. So these included repeat voters who were used to stuff ballot boxes, fraudulent ballots that were printed in order to trick illiterate Black voters into voting for Democratic candidates, and ballot boxes themselves, which are held back in order to have more votes added to them later. So most significantly, perhaps, was the intimidation and violence perpetrated against Blacks in an attempt to keep them away from polling places altogether. So African Americans were, of course, overwhelmingly Republican at the time, since the party stood for equal rights, while Democrats were by and large subjugating Black Americans. So to be sure, Republicans were also guilty of illegal activities at the ballot box. In the end, not surprisingly, all three electoral boards in the contested states certified the Republican electors. Now, all of the electoral votes had to be certified by the president of the Senate, who is also vice president of the U.S. The problem was Grant's VP, Henry Wilson, died in November of 1875, and no one took his place. So despite the returning boards certifying the Republican electors in three contested states, both parties brought the results to Washington, claiming to represent the winner. So the president pro tem, Senator Thomas Ferry of Michigan, took Wilson's place as president of the Senate, but since he was not vice president, he declined to make the decision to settle anything with the election, citing no direction from the Constitution in this regard. So on December 21st, a special Senate committee was announced that would establish a process for resolving the disputed electoral count. And on December 22nd, another was established for the House of Representatives. Now, in 1876, the Democrats held the majority in the House and Republicans held the Senate. So both Hayes and Tilden distanced themselves from these events, leaving matters to the respective representatives, who informed them of developments as they unfolded. Though in January 1877, the Senate passed the Electoral Commission Bill, which established a 15-member commission comprised of 5 senators, 5 representatives, and 5 Supreme Court justices. So this commission would decide the outcome of the election, and its decisions would be final unless both houses of Congress overrode it. So there were 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans in this commission, with one independent, Justice David Davis, who was assumed to be the deciding vote on this issue. However, Davis was elected to the U.S. Senate in Illinois by a Democratic Greenback coalition and resigned from the Supreme Court, refusing to serve on the commission. And so the Democrats thought they were going to be able to sort of buy his vote by doing this, but it ended up turning against them. So Justice Joseph Bradley, a Republican, filled his place, making the final count 8 Republicans to 7 Democrats. So on February 1st, Congress met in a joint session to count the electoral votes for president and vice president, and Ferry, the pro tem of the Senate, opened the electoral reports and began counting the state's results in alphabetical order. So when Florida was presented, there were conflicting returns, which were then sent to the Electoral Commission. And so lawyers from both sides argued the cases, and each contested state was decided separately. So all of the decisions were made as anticipated along party lines. So on February 9th, Florida went to Hayes 8-7. On the 16th, Louisiana went to Hayes on the same vote. On the 23rd, Oregon's 1 electoral vote was awarded to the Republican. And finally, on the 27th, South Carolina was declared for Hayes. So the final tally in the 3 states was as follows. So this did not mean that Hayes won just yet, though. The Senate still had to confirm these electoral votes. On March 2nd, at 4:10 a.m., Congress in a joint session finally declared Rutherford B. Hayes President of the United States and William Wheeler Vice President. So the final electoral tally was 185 for Hayes and 184 for Tilden. So at the urging of Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, Rutherford Hayes took the oath of office from Chief Justice Morrison R. Waite at a private dinner party given by the Grants on March 3rd to sort of forestall the dangers of an interregnum. Since the traditional inauguration day of March 4th fell on a Sunday, Hayes actually held the public inauguration on Monday, March 5th on the steps of the Capitol, where before a crowd of 30,000 spectators, he became the 19th president of the United States. So one of the central questions of this election revolves around the notion of whether or not Hayes made a deal with Democrats for the presidency. So historian C. Van Woodward coined the phrase the Compromise of 1877 in his 1951 book, Reunion and Reaction. So in it, Woodward argues that representatives of both parties met at the Wormley Hotel in Washington, D.C. on February 26th and negotiated and drew up terms of agreement at the meeting. So these terms were as follows. Hayes would withdraw all troops from the State House property in the contested states. Funds would be provided to build the Texas and Pacific Railroad. A Southerner would be appointed as Postmaster General. Funds would be appropriated to rebuild the economy in the South, and that the solution to the race problem would be left to the state governments in the South. So the problem with this argument is that Hayes stated during his campaign that the remaining Southern states would be returned to local rule if they would uphold these states' rights of all citizens. Also, during the campaign, Hayes promised to appoint a Southerner, pardon me, to his cabinet as a move toward unification and bipartisan cooperation. During Hayes's presidency, the South did not receive a large influx of money to rebuild its economy, nor were any appropriations made for the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Excuse me. What's more, this so-called secret compromise was not a secret at all. It was actually published in newspapers that the two factions would be meeting at the Wormley. So in Hayes's nomination acceptance letter on July 8, 1876, he wrote of his ardent wish to end sectional identities and allow the South to form its own governments as prescribed by the Constitution. So this latter part seems vital as it shows why Hayes would eventually pull troops back to their barracks in the two remaining Republican-controlled Southern states. Perhaps most significantly in relation to all of this, though, is the fact that African Americans had been restricted from voting. So Hayes would have probably won the election anyway. And this slide demonstrates that here. So what we see is in the sort of center column with the highlights, the amount of Republican voters registered in these Southern counties. And on the right, Republican votes actually cast. So if you look, for instance, at Feliciana East, you have one Republican voting when there were over 2,000 that had registered. So interestingly, at the end of his book, Woodward actually demonstrates that though the Wormley meeting did in fact take place, it was more of a bluff session than anything and had no consequence on the outcome of the election itself. But the introduction of the idea of a secret agreement, particularly in light of the consequences it would have for African Americans, became a decidedly damning notion that has influenced interpretation on the matter since. So the truth is, Reconstruction was really in its death throes by the time of Hayes's election. So in the words of R.A. Hugenboom, Hayes's primary biographer, quote, with the exception of a few square miles, Reconstruction was, pardon me, within the exception of a few square miles, Reconstruction had ended before Hayes entered the White House. So the 11 Southern states that had seceded where by 1870, they're all readmitted into the Union. And due to a lack of public support and a shrunken army, Grant would not place any more troops in the South. So there were only 2 states in the South left with Republican governors by 1877, Louisiana and South Carolina. So they controlled a small area around their respective state houses, an area which was protected by federal troops. In order to continue to uphold these governments, more troops would be required, but few were available. So by the late 1870s, the federal army numbered just around 25,000, and the Democratic House of Representatives refused to fund them beyond July. So further complicating things, for Hayes, Northern opinion did not favor extending military occupation of the South. So Hayes sought to put aside the bayonet, quote, as he said, if the South would respect the civil rights of African Americans. And on April 3rd, 1877, he ordered the troops withdrawn from their posts back to the barracks of South Carolina. And on April 20th, the same for the troops in Louisiana. So this moment is typically accepted as the end of Reconstruction in the United States, but was it? So Hayes did not make a compromise for the presidency, but he was naive in believing that the civil rights of Blacks would be respected by Southern whites. So the early interpretation of Reconstruction, known as the Dunning School, argued that Reconstruction was a period when Southern whites were tread upon and exploited by Blacks, Northern whites, and pro-white Southerners, also known as scallywags. So this decidedly incorrect perspective was not really corrected, though, until about the 1960s. Woodward's book in the 1950s became really an historical source for scholars who have purposefully or not misconstrued the outcome and cloud the real story of the election of 1876. So those who argue on the side of the compromise incorrectly place full blame for ending Reconstruction on Hayes's shoulder. But the question that should really be asked is, excuse me again, did Reconstruction actually ever end? Well, and scholars have posited many dates for this besides 1877, including the 1870 ratification of the 15th Amendment, the Supreme Court's overturning of the aspects of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal law, 1954's Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the election of Barack Obama in 2008. So seeing as that the Reconstruction period does not really fall into any neat category in American history and involves so many factors, this argument will without question continue for years to come. I'll go ahead and stop share there.
Hey, thank you very much, Josh. We appreciate your remarks. And next, we're going to hear from Erin Adams. And there she is. So Erin has been the Director of Education at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage since 2013, overseeing all K-12, lifelong learning, and youth leadership initiatives. Prior to her time at the Hermitage, Erin served as an educator and administrator at museums and historic sites in Tennessee, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Since coming to the Hermitage, Erin has tried to make the interpretation of Jacksonian America relevant to modern audiences by developing audio tours, school curriculum, and building relationships with stakeholders of all kinds. Her philosophy is that all meaningful learning is built together, shared in community, and useful for problem solving. Erin, we're turning things over to you.
Thanks. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm really excited to get to do this presentation alongside of our colleagues at Hayes. Sorry, I got distracted by the technology doing something weird. So pleasure to be with all of you this evening. It's really fascinating to listen to the story about the Hayes election, because now I have all sorts of questions, but we'll let your questions come first. And then I got a few of my own I'm going to ask at some point. So I hope you can see my screen in front of you right now. It is a white screen that just reads the corrupt bargain. So somebody let me know if you cannot see that, and we'll make sure that we get that settled. When we talk about Andrew Jackson's elections, you may know that Andrew Jackson ran for office 3 different times for the presidency. He runs in 1824, 1828, and then re-election in 1832. And of all of those elections that he participated in, by far the most important one is the one we're going to discuss tonight, which is the election of 1824. This is the election that Jackson loses. We've heard it said often that often you learn more lessons when you fail rather than when you succeed. And this is going to be absolutely an eye-opener for Andrew Jackson, not only in the process of elections, the balance of features related to elections that the Constitution requires and calls for, and when they may not work so smoothly hand in hand, but it is really going to reveal an early naivety on Jackson's part about about the very nature of our government. And by that, I specifically mean that central relationship between democracy and republicanism. When are we a democracy and how do we function that way? When are we a republic and how do we function in that way? So join me as we march through Jackson's election of 1824. Now, it's fair to say that when the election begins, Andrew Jackson is on the back foot of the candidates that are running. There are four primary candidates that are running in the 1824 election. What I'd like to do to start off is to share with you the qualifications of these four candidates. And then what I would love for you to do, and you can throw this into the chat function and I'll see it as it comes up. And so what I'd like for you to do is just respond on the qualifications. So out of candidates A, B, C, and D, which one do you think would make the strongest choice for the selection of President of the United States in 1824? Okay. So candidate A. Candidate A is actually going to start out at the head of the pack. This man is a former Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury. He had briefly even served as the Vice President. He had a reputation for being kind of a direct, straight-talking sort of person, and he killed a guy in a duel, like you do in the 19th century. Candidate B. This person probably has the most has a very impressive set of qualifications. He is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's already earned a nickname at a young age, which is the Great Compromiser. One does not get that kind of a nickname because you're not good at compromising. Now, this guy is also a Westerner through and through. So he appeals to Westerners in his love of gambling, in his passion for thoroughbred racehorses and horse racing culture in the Western states at this point. Candidate C, who does not start out at the head of the pack, though, I think brings probably the most impressive set of qualifications. Certainly, if you've studied this man, you might feel the same way. But this man had been a former Secretary of State, had served as the minister to Russia, France, Prussia, under multiple presidential administrations. He was a science enthusiast, very passionate about the fields of astronomy and horticulture, and the man speaks 7 languages. All right, so that's candidate C. And then we come down to candidate D. Candidate D did have federal experience. He had served as both a U.S. representative and as a senator, surprisingly enough, not elected to either of those roles, but rather appointed to those roles. So he is going to spend time as both a U.S. representative and a senator. He is a military general, so he's got that national defense credential behind him. But the man is a bit of a hot potato. He's known for his temper, his kind of violent manner of speech, and just like candidate A, this man has also killed a man in a duel. Again, not a secret. This is known in his time. So go into the chat function if you like, and just drop in A, B, C, or D. If you had to choose a candidate based on these qualifications, who are you going for? All right, I'm seeing some C's. I'm seeing a couple of B's. C, C, B, B, D. Cheryl Alexander, that was bold. Tara Gilbert, C. D or C? C. All right, so lots of votes for C. And honestly, friends, I am with you in this regard. Now, candidate A, we can go ahead and meet these candidates. You may know some of them and you may not. William Crawford was a stranger to me when I first started working at the Hermitage. William Crawford was from Virginia initially. He was a senator from Georgia. Where William Crawford, though, is going to kind of drop out of this election is that he suffers a massive stroke very close to the election. And so he will still remain on the ballot technically, but he will not be in any practical way, a solid choice for the presidency. This stroke left him without the ability to see, hear, walk, talk, and so he has an extremely long road of recovery ahead of him. Candidate B, which also got a good number of votes, you might have recognized as Henry Clay, one of Jackson's arch nemesis. Henry Clay, of course, the Great Compromiser, helps us establish a status quo treaty out of the War of 1812. Clay is going to be instrumental to Jackson in the future, getting him out of several different scrapes that Jackson is getting himself into, and yet they have a very contentious relationship. Candidate C is honestly my choice on paper, right? This is John Quincy Adams, a man who was almost literally born to be a public office holder and groomed as such from a very young age. There's an excellent biography, if you haven't read it, by Fred Kaplan on Adams, and it's just an exceptional study in a life of somebody who was bred to public service. But then, of course, you have candidate D, and that's Andrew Jackson. You might have been able to figure that out. So going into this race, our candidates in order are William Crawford at the head of the pack, John Quincy Adams kind of coming up for second place at this point, but Clay and Jackson are sort of tied, but way at the back of the pack too. There is going to be a game changer, though. And that is this gentleman here in front of us. 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette, of course, the great revolutionary hero from France, announces that he is coming to the United States for a tour of the nation. He wants to visit some old revolutionary colleagues. He wants to see the successes that have been made in the United States as a result of the revolution. And so Jackson sees this as an opportunity. He writes the Marquis a letter, and here's what he says: "You risked your fortunes with those of then hopeless America, but thank heaven America triumphed, and now with the gratitude of 10 millions of free men, she salutes you as one of the fathers of her glorious existence. Welcome then is echoed from every bosom, and from none with more pure fervor than from the patriotic citizens of Tennessee." I think with Jackson, this resonates very strongly. You might remember that Jackson is a Revolutionary War veteran himself at a very young age, suffers the loss of his entire family as a result, and is the only of the presidents of the United States to have ever spent time as a prisoner of war, and that's at the age of 14 under the British in South Carolina. Here is Lafayette's response to Jackson. He says, "I express relief, joy, and pride on receiving the glorious account of your victory," meaning at New Orleans in 1815. "I will not leave the United States before I have sought and found the opportunity to express in person my high regard and sincere friendship." If you are Andrew Jackson, you're running at the back of the pack. You have very strong feelings against at least two of your fellow candidates. You are not going to leave these letters from Lafayette just sitting on your desk. Jackson sees this as an opportunity to gain a little momentum. And so Jackson's election team, calling themselves the Nashville Junto, began publishing this exchange of letters between Lafayette and Jackson in national newspapers. And it has the desired effect, that this is going to really cause people to look at Jackson with a sense of gravitas that they might not have initially brought to him as a political agent, although they certainly would have given him full regards for his military skill. But now they're able to see him in a little bit more polished light, acceptable to a former founding father of the United States. The Marquis is going to do a tremendous amount to boost Jackson's options and optics here in this. So there's so many wonderful political cartoons throughout American history, and this one is such an incredible one in helping us understand that 1824 race. So the name of this cartoon is called A Foot Race, and it's by Daniel Pearl. It is published in October of 1824, so we're moving into that last 6 weeks or so before the 1824 election. At this point, the order of the candidates has begun to change, and you can tell in this cartoon. Sometimes with these, though, all the visual images tend to get a little overlapped. So let me lay this out just in case you're having a little struggle seeing it. Of course, you see our four candidates running in the field. Three of the candidates are fairly close together. They're far to the left side of the image. And then our fourth candidate is sort of stopped running. Daniel Pearl is seeing the order of the election now in this way. First of all, William Crawford, having suffered this stroke, has now begun to slip back into second place. And you can see how John Quincy Adams is nudging ahead of him, just sort of by a head at this point. Henry Clay is the candidate far to the right side of the image who has just frankly stopped running. He's standing there scratching his head, and a buddy is, kind of got his hand on his shoulder to encourage him or to console him. But then you have Jackson. Jackson is clearly in third place. There's no question. This is not a photo finish. There's no question that Jackson is sort of looking in the third place spot. But as I often talk about with students, what about this body language and these visual elements help us understand about what Pearl is trying to say? First of all, if you look at Jackson's body language, the man is flat out horizontal, right? He's got his right leg is almost, parallel to the ground. Behind his left heel, you can see where dust clouds are kicking up on the road, which of course is meant to suggest that he's picking up speed, he's picking up power. And so you have this sense that while Adams is flat out running, here comes Jackson, and that power that he's bringing to the race now may very well allow him to catch Adams. So Jackson, because of this exchange with the Marquis de Lafayette, because of Crawford's unfortunate health situation, Jackson is gaining momentum steadily heading into the final weeks of the 24 election. So when the results come down, it is not a decided issue about whether it will be Adams or Jackson. People are looking eagerly to see what is going to happen in these. So you're looking at a map of the United States now. The color code here are those pink states, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky. These are where voting constitutionally is permitted and happening in the United States. Well, you can see we have plenty of territories that we are moving into, but based on the Constitution's requirements, they do not have voting rights as yet. So we're not looking at the full spectrum of voters. Rather, we're looking at very specific states. So here are the results, and let me give you the key. The red states, Illinois, Indiana, and so forth, these are states where Jackson emerges as the victor of the popular vote. The blue states, New York, Vermont, so forth, this is John Quincy Adams. He is carrying the majority, more than 50% of the vote in those areas. The yellow states, Missouri, Kentucky, Ohio, no surprise, these are Clay's states. Clay is a Virginian originally, but moves to Kentucky. And so these states are very much linked with Henry Clay. Crawford, though, stays on the ballot. It's too late to pull him off. And so we do see him with a respectable turnout given the situation. Virginia, his home state, Georgia, his adopted home state, and Delaware are going to cast the majority of their popular vote for Crawford. Okay, so just looking at the map and just looking at the way kind of the color coding of all this falls out, it seems that Jackson is going to walk away with this election. Adams has got a solid representation. New York is the most populous state in the country at this point, but you have got a substantial representation of popular vote going for Jackson in these red states. So it's pretty close. In fact, when you look at the final popular vote results, what you end up with is, what you end up with in the popular vote results is that Jackson has carried the largest share of the popular vote, just as Hayes did a moment ago. So you have Jackson, and you can see the numbers here. Jackson comes in at the largest share of the popular vote. It's about 44% of the popular vote. Adams coming in a close second with about 41% of the popular vote. And then Clay, understandably getting more votes than Crawford at the bottom. But as we know, the Constitution calls for the Electoral College, which is a Republican reflection of the nature of our government. And when the electoral votes are cast in December of 1824, once again, Jackson emerges at the head of the pack. 99 of the electoral votes. Adams back just a little bit further at 84 of those votes. This puts Jackson at, I think, 47 of the total electoral vote. Adams just shortly back behind that, about 43%. And this time Clay and Crawford actually swap places. But again, such a large distance in the numbers between the two of them and Adams and Jackson that it's almost no contest at this point. So what's the problem? Well, as you know, the Constitution calls for 50% or more of the vote, and that is the constitutional majority. And just as with Hayes and Tilden, nobody has that at this point. So what do we do now? That is what the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States has created for us. And I'll read this. It's a rather lengthy little passage. It is the 12th Amendment is ratified in 1801 as a result of the tumult around the Jefferson Burr election of 1800, but it hasn't had to be used. Interestingly enough, with Andrew Jackson, you often find Jackson in a position of testing out things. Somehow he is the guy who manages to be in the moment when all of a sudden a constitutional challenge is called for. Just because we wrote an amendment outlining how the president is selected when the popular and electoral college votes do not render you a president. We haven't had to use it. But here's Jackson testing it out. This is a common theme throughout his presidency. All right, here's the 12th Amendment. If no person has such a majority, meaning the constitutional majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3, on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice. In typical constitutional style, it tells us what we should do. It doesn't always tell us how we should do it. And so this is going to be the moment at which Jackson's again, naivety is the word that comes to mind. I don't know if it's exactly accurate. If somebody has a better one, I'm happy to consider it. But this is where Jackson is going to show a bit of a naivety in the outcome of the election. So in this case, the representation from each state gets 1 vote, meaning, so Tennessee, it has 9 members of the House of Representatives, they get 1 vote. All 9 of them are going to have to agree on the person they want, right? So the vote does not happen per representative, rather it happens per state. And so 24 states are in the union at this point. Okay, so here's where the naivety comes in. Do you see where, let me go back to the 12th Amendment real quick. Did you see here where it says the vote shall be, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately, but in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by the states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. This is the moment of naivety, because what Jackson ends up doing is assuming that the representation from each state will follow the path of their popular voters or the path of their electoral voters. And because Jackson got the largest share of both of those things, even without the constitutional majority, because he got the largest share to Jackson, this says the most Americans want Jackson to be president, not Adams. Jackson is going to sit back and frankly assume that this is how the representatives are going to go about choosing the president. So he sits back. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, however, are far more polished politicians. They have been in the game much longer than Andrew Jackson has. These men are consummate politicians. I don't have a better way to say it. They know what the boundaries of the Constitution are. They know where the boundaries of law are, so they know the parameters that they have to work in order to create and to put their machinations behind a solution that's going to work for the both of them. And that is going to happen on January the 9th, 1825. So after December of 24, when the Electoral College votes, they announced that the House of Representatives will vote on February the 9th, 1825, leaving all the candidates really about a 6-week period or so, given the holidays are in there, but a 6-week period before the House of Representatives will vote. Jackson opts to sit back. Let this process take its course. Adams and Clay decide to get to work instead. Now, everything else that I'm about to share with you is innuendo and rumor, my friends, but it's a little sketchy. These are innuendos and rumors that began to travel very quickly after the 1824 election. The image that you see to the left of your screen here is a page out of Adams's diary. I don't know how many of you were ever on Twitter, which is now X. I joined Twitter in 2008 because the Massachusetts Historical Society was publishing Adams's diaries, 1 tweet at a time. And it was fascinating reading. And so I joined Twitter because I wanted to read along with Adams's diaries. And one thing you learn about Adams's diaries and Adams as a diarist is that this man is going to tell you everything that you didn't know you wanted to know about him, and plenty of stuff that you really didn't want to know. His diary entries will include the color of the vest he was wearing that day, the menu when he dined with Tsar Nicholas or Tsar Alexander, the page of which book he stopped on for the night, the name of the horses that he rode that day, just in a minutia of detail, which is fascinating as a historian. But what that means is that when you begin to look at when you get used to his language, you begin to realize when there's something he is not telling you. And this entry from January 8th, 1825 looks real short, and is very short compared to many diary entries that Adams will make throughout his life. Here's what it says. Mr. Clay came at 6 and spent the evening with me in a long conversation explanatory of the past and prospective of the future. There's no details in that. You didn't tell me what the menu was. What is this past and perspective? Like, what was the explanation of the past? What does that mean? What are you talking about? What is the perspective for the future, right? And so all the questions, right, about what this is. Shortly after this dinner happens, people begin to infer what was discussed at this dinner in light of what happens next. Clay gets to work. He withdraws his own candidacy. In all practical purposes, he can no longer withdraw his name from the ballot officially. He will be one of the 3 candidates that they're looking at, but for all practical purposes, he signals very strongly that he will not be under consideration for the presidency. Clay has ambitions, and so he decides that his best options are to unite behind Adams and use that as a stepping stone to the presidency. He will not be uniting himself behind Jackson, and frankly, Jackson wouldn't have any of Clay anyway. So rumors begin to get around because Clay immediately gets to work over this 6-week period, really whining and dining, negotiating, compromising, speaking with members of the House of Representatives. Remember, the guy's the Speaker of the House, and it's his organization that will choose the president. And Clay makes any number of compromises and negotiations in order to put support behind John Quincy Adams. Now, this is known. Everybody's watching Clay do this. Jackson and members of the Jackson camp are starting to get a little turned off by this. Jackson reflects on what he is observing and hearing when he says, intrigue, corruption, and sale of public office is the rumor of the day. How humiliating to the American character that its high functionaries should conduct themselves to as become liable to the interpretation of bargain and sale of the constitutional rights of the people. All of Jackson's worst fears are being realized in this statement, that it's humiliating to the American character with all this backroom dealing. Are we really going to bargain and sell the people's voice, the people's constitutional rights? So Jackson is gonna bang a very familiar drum for those of us who study him about the disregard for the people, the disregard for the voice of the people. But Jackson's fears are founded because when the election happens, February the 9th, 1825, now looking at that color coding again, you can see it visually, you can see it by the numbers here. Adams sweeps the election. Remember, 24 states, that means a constitutional majority is 13 out of 24, and that's exactly the number that John Quincy Adams hits. Jackson comes in with 7 representative votes, and Crawford, I misspoke earlier. Crawford remains on the ballot. Clay steps off of it, and Crawford only carries 4 of the electoral votes in this way. So what do you suppose Jackson's reaction to this is? Clay and Adams are thrilled. This is exactly what they were working for, and Adams is excited to go ahead. He is now the president, or will be, on March 4th, just a month from this election. Most people's concerns over rumors are solidified when Clay is immediately named Adams' Secretary of State. Out of our first 5 presidents, 4 of them had served as Secretary of State. That was often considered the most plumb step up to the presidency, was from the Secretary of State position. And sure enough, here comes Henry Clay walking directly into that. So what is the response from the Jackson camp? Friends, this language is about to get positively biblical. Andrew Jackson Donaldson, who's Jackson's nephew, his private secretary, later will be his chief of staff, says the closing scenes of this nefarious drama is not yet acted out, nor will it be until the 4th of March, when Mr. Adams is to seal with his oath all his corrupt bargains. So it is Donaldson who coins that expression, the corrupt bargain. But listen to Jackson's. The election is over and Mr. Adams prevailed on the first ballot. Thus you see here the voice of the people of the West have been disregarded, and the demagogues barter them as sheep in the shambles for their own views and personal aggrandizement. This is a letter to Jackson's campaign or one of his campaign managers, John Overton. But then Jackson writes a letter to his friend, Major William Lewis, and now the language is just elevated substantially. So you see the Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver. His end will be the same. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before? So Jackson has now moved into biblical territory. He is Jesus Christ, and Judas Iscariot has betrayed him with a kiss. He will receive that 30 pieces of silver in payment. And just as Judas kills himself out of guilt and grief, Adams's and Clay's outcome may not be much different. All right. So I am going to wrap up very quickly, and then we'll turn it over to the questions that Christy's been getting ready together for us. Why does Jackson sit back in this moment of again, seeming naivety? It speaks to the central tension, I think, that exists in the United States. We are not a republic, purely. We are not a democracy, purely. We are a democratic republic. And Jackson, who so strongly identified with the concept of democracy, expects the voice of the people to carry. The voice of the people is captured in the popular vote, not the Electoral College. That's the Republican aspect of our government. And even though there was not a constitutional majority in Jackson's mind, it still shows the largest share of the people of the United States have cast their ballot for Jackson. To give you some comparison points, when the House of Representatives votes in 1825, not a single, I'm sorry, the state of Kentucky is the perfect one to look at. The state of Kentucky goes for John Quincy Adams in the House of Representatives election. That is very much due to Clay's work. Again, Clay's home state is Kentucky, but not one single popular vote in the November vote had been cast in the state of Kentucky for John Quincy Adams. So Jackson looks at this and cannot conceive of a reason at all why the electors, why the House of Representatives would not follow the popular vote in the election. It is a staggering moment for Jackson. And like I said, sometimes when we lose, this is when we learn our greatest lessons. Jackson is going to come out on the front end of this, going into the 28 election, which of course he will win. And so this is very much going to shape Jackson's political rhetoric and dealings from this point out. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Jossie and Christy.
Thank you very much, Erin. That was terrific. So as Jossie just mentioned in the chat, we are ready for your questions. We have a few minutes left here in our time this evening. So if you've been mulling over some thoughts and you would like to ask our expert panelists here some questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat. Julie Miley, who is you saw briefly at the beginning of our program, I would like to thank her for her assistance as well. She's our manuscript curator here at Hayes. She's been kind of running some tech on the back end for us on the program tonight, and she's just posted a poll here. You can probably see that on your screen. So we would love to get some feedback from you on this program. And this will be very helpful to both the Hermitage and us at Hayes Presidential as we plan future programs. So if you could take a few minutes, we're giving you a lot to do all of a sudden. Put your questions in the chat and answer our poll. But we'll leave the poll up here for a few minutes till the end of our program so that you have time to answer those questions. So while people are thinking of their questions, I have a couple of questions for you, Erin and Josh. I'm wondering, as I'm hearing you present both Hayes and Jackson and the work that they were doing during their campaigns, it occurred to me that campaigns in the 19th century are very different from campaigns today. So could you each explain a little bit more about how what kind of activities they were doing to carry their message to the people as part of their campaign efforts? Was that more behind the scenes efforts that they were doing or out in the public eye? Curious how you might respond to that or give us a little more information on that.
Well, I guess I could start, Aaron, so give you a break.
Right.
Um, well, yeah, they were quite different. I mean, of course, you didn't have that national reach, right? You didn't have radio. I mean, you didn't have television. You didn't have these things. So you had to really take the message to the people. One way they're doing this is sort of whistle stop campaign tours,
Mm.
even though they're not maybe officially called that or being seen as that. They are literally taking the message to the people by getting on these trains and pulling up to a stop, and people gather around them and they deliver their message. They're doing front porch talks, some of them, where folks would come and gather around. And Garfield's real famous for this, so doing the front porch speeches. As far as how are they involved, though, I mean, it's really interesting with Hayes and Tilden because, as I mentioned in my presentation, they're very much behind the scenes. They're not trying to be seen as being involved in this at all because they think it's sort of going to kind of taint the results. And as far as the Wormley situation with the Wormley Hotel, this really comes back to this whole notion of this idea that these people are arguing this in Hayes's favor, for Hayes, when he's really just, again, kind of behind the scenes, sitting back saying, I don't want to be seen as tainting this whatsoever. I'll let you representatives, do what you're going to do with this, and hopefully the outcome comes out as it is, but whatever is lawfully correct. Aaron, I'm sure there's plenty you want to add about the 1830s, 1820s.
It's brutal. Andrew, when Andrew Jackson is so in the 24 election, word is passed through. There is a thriving business in the production of pamphlets, broadsides. We're moving out of the 18th century, which was almost strictly printed material. But the railroad is not super. The railroad is not super functional yet in Jackson's time. In fact, he's the first president to ride on a rail car. And so it is still very much dependent on the printed word. So Jackson's campaign, the Nashville Junto, they are publishing various pamphlets, responding to newspaper articles, op-eds and that sort of thing. One of my favorite methods of campaigning that is used by Jackson, or used by the Jackson camp rather, not by Jackson, is what were called Hickory Clubs, using this nickname of Old Hickory, as you know. And so communities around the nation. There's a community in Indiana that still does it today, and I cannot remember the name of it, but I could look it up. But they still do hickory clubs. So what they would do is erect a limb of hickory that still had a tuft of leaves at the top, and then you would just, community members would essentially create their own campaign art and like nail it to this post, this pole, just in the center of town on the community square, and then you began to understand the feelings of your neighbors, and they would have period speeches, get-togethers, barbecues, so it would foster a series of community events. But Jackson is still very much staying out of the campaigning. Again, it's a combination of the perceived modesty or humility, if you will, of candidates during this period. Jackson is nominated by the Tennessee State Legislature to run for office. Jackson does not opt into, in terms of the way we would candidates would do it today. So it's there's a kind of a modesty or a humility, if you will, to kind of staying out of the fray of campaigning. Of course, by the 1828 election, it is so nasty between John Quincy Adams and Jackson that is sort of a thing of the past after 1828. So it's going to begin evolving rapidly into more candidate directed campaigning than team directed campaigning, if you will.
Definitely. And there's also this notion of sort of underpinning it of being kind of like Washington, right? Where you're not out there actively trying to maybe get the office, that you're not sort of electioneering for yourself, which I think is an important aspect that a lot of people don't think about when they think about these early days, that it's not the same thing as what we see today. But yeah, it's sort of on an unrelated subject, but related, talking about like the ephemera and that too. We have some great things in the Hayes collection of one is a paper lantern, which took to a school recently to do a presentation. And so you sort of pull the lantern up and there's Hayes's face on it. So you put a candle on it. So it's kind of the equivalent of, say, maybe like the signs we stick out in the yard today. So those are interesting.
Political ephemera for presidential campaigns is so wonderful. We have an item in oh, Nathan, that was bad. That was real bad. But we have an item in our collection that's a thread box. So it's just a little sewing notion. The box is about the size of an index card. It's made of paper. brilliantly printed, very colorful. There's silk. It's like a cardboard base with silk over top of it. And it would hold a small pair of like embroidery scissors, some thread, but even like women's household tools, right, are being manufactured that have this candidacy message on it. Like vote for General Jackson. And it's this really lovely little object. So there is a lot of ephemera going around in the Jackson period too, but such a fascinating study. I love the idea of a lantern. I think that's really cool. Not as much as Nathan does, but it's pretty cool.
Okay. We did have a question from Nathan that I think you sort of touched on, but I will ask because I think there's another component that he's getting at. But he's wondering if any candidates after Hayes and Jackson looked back at their campaigns to determine strategies to help them determine their strategies for what to do or what not to do.
Yes. Yes. In Jackson's case, William Henry Harrison, albeit not the most, successful president that we have had, but William Henry Harrison does, and of course John Tyler is his running mate. They spend a great deal of time pulling on and casting Harrison in this populist light. Now, Harrison and Jackson don't get along. Their interpretations of populism are a bit different. But this idea that now presidents must address the people, that they must speak directly to the people, that they must answer directly to the people is so strong after Jackson's time. So for somebody who is not as naturally gifted at it, as you will, as Harrison, it feels like it's a must do. And so his campaigning begins, the different expressions of campaigning that the campaign is putting out is very much building on some of those same tropes as Jackson, a man of the people, a man who comes from these Western upbringings and origins, this military service that Harrison has made to the Union, the fact that the War of 1812 is that, final great effort to officially not only wrench ourselves from Great Britain, but to prove to the rest of the world that we will not be picked on again, that that the United States will become equal to any of the great powers of the Western Hemisphere. So Harrison for sure is going to reach for a lot of those same methods that Jackson is using.
Yeah, I think I'd almost like to turn it more toward the idea of how do we keep the contested elections from happening again. And so you could go to the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which is sort of trying to define and set in stone how we'll be able to find these outcomes without this becoming this problematic thing where you have to develop a commission. Part of the issue was the language of the 12th Amendment, where it's talking about that the states are going to bring their returns and to Congress, and then there before the House of Representatives, the pro tem is going to count them, but they don't literally name the pro tem as the person who's going to count them. So who counts them? Is it the House? Is it the pro tem? So it gets a little confusing. So it's interesting to see this having political consequences, but also constitutional consequences. How can we, affect this to make this so it doesn't happen again? So I think that's maybe even more interesting than specific strategies that would follow.
I would agree with that, Josh. Like I mentioned, that Jackson often finds himself in a position of just having to test things out, and so often the ongoing result or the ongoing relevance of Jackson's moments, they're being tested out by the Constitution. And so Jackson is not always president around to see the outcome of that, but it is providing some of these initial tests to things that have very significant consequences for the Constitution. Absolutely. I think you've hit the right idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, the 1820s and 1830s both being not just like politically significant also, but, of course, culturally, economically, I mean, there's so much that's taking form in those 2 decades that's really vital that sometimes gets overlooked.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we are just a little bit beyond the hour length of our program, but it looks like we've got one more question here. So the question from Christopher is, would the Electoral Count Act be a reaction to the election of 1876, or is that too far of a length of time after?
Yes, it is. It's a reaction to what's going on. sort of like how I mentioned earlier about the Civil Rights Act of 1875, really you're not seeing things start to shift there where elements of that are being retracted until 1883. So sometimes it's the legacies or the conversations that are happening after this period that lead to the legislation. You know, as you know, Washington, things sometimes creep. Thank you for the question.
Okay, well, Josh, Aaron, thank you so much for your presentations tonight. Jossie, thank you for your coordination, facilitation of all this. We're just, again, we're so thrilled to be able to collaborate with you on this program. And again, thank you to everyone who was part of the call. We really appreciate you spending your Thursday evening with us, and appreciate you responding to our poll too, which will help with our future programs. So everyone have a great night, and keep paying attention to your presidential history. We love how enthusiastic you are about continuing your education. That gives us a chance to share with you all what we love to do and what we're passionate about. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.